The town of Dry Creek lay beneath a scorching sun, its main street stretching out like a dusty scar between leaning buildings of timber and brick. The saloon doors swung endlessly with men drifting in and out, their laughter spilling into the open air, mingling with the sharp tang of whiskey and tobacco smoke. Horses stamped impatient hooves at the hitching posts, tails swishing at the flies. A dog barked from a shadowed porch, and children darted between wagon wheels, barefoot and wild. It was Saturday, the day when the town gathered. The air was thick with chatter, coins clinking, the sharp call of merchants hawking wares, and the metallic rasp of spurs on hard-packed dirt. At the center of it all, a crude platform had been erected. A banner, already tattered by the wind, proclaimed, "Auction today." The crowd gathered around it, with a restless eagerness, men jostling each other for a better view. Some had come for cattle, others for tools, but most lingered for the spectacle they knew was coming, the sale of a woman. From the edge of the platform, she was led out. Mei Lin's wrists were bound in iron shackles, the chain clinking with every hesitant step. Her dress, once a fine piece of pale silk, had been torn and stained from travel and rough hands. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks, damp with sweat, framing eyes that refused to lift from the ground. She moved with the fragile grace of someone who had been broken too many times and yet still refused to fall. A murmur rolled through the crowd as the auctioneer, a stout man with a red face and a voice like a whip crack, shoved her forward to stand in the light. "Step lively, sweetheart," he barked. "Ain't no use looking shy now." He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms wide. "Gentlemen, and you fine ladies hiding behind the rest, today we've got a rare prize indeed. Fresh from the Orient, a bride fit for service or companionship, whichever suits your tastes." Laughter erupted, sharp and mocking. A tall ranch hand near the front whistled low. "Looks like she'd break in half tryin' to haul water." Another shouted, "Don't need her for chores. Reckon she could warm a cold bed." The laughter grew, a cruel wave that washed over the platform. Mei Lin shut her eyes briefly. For a moment the noise faded, replaced by memory. She saw the rolling deck of the ship that had carried her across the endless sea, the faces of girls like her huddled together, clinging to hope. She remembered her father's quiet weeping the day she had left her village, believing she would be safe, that a promised marriage to a man in America would give her a life better than hunger and war. She remembered the betrayal, the man never came, the debts called in, and herself sold like a parcel. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to breathe. The auctioneer's hand clamped on her arm, dragging her back to the present. Now, don't all talk at once," he bellowed. "We'll start the bidding at $10. A rough laugh answered. "10? For her? I wouldn't pay $5. "5 then. 6, 7, just to see her squirm." The bids came, not in earnest but in mockery, men elbowing each other, tossing coins as if it were a game. The auctioneer fanned the flames, grinning with each shouted number. "That's the spirit, boys. Where's the next man with guts enough to claim her?" On the far side of the crowd, a tall man stood silent, his weathered hat casting a shadow across his eyes. Beside him, a small boy gripped his rough, calloused hand, tugging gently. James McAllister had not come for this. His list was simple: nails, flour, a coil of rope. Supplies for the ranch that swallowed his days and nights. Since his wife's death 2 winters ago, the ranch had been both his burden and his salvation, the only thing keeping him from drowning in grief. But no matter how many fences he mended, no matter how many cattle he drove, the emptiness in his house remained. He glanced down at his boy. Daniel's cheeks were flushed from the sun, his hair sticking up where the breeze had teased it. The child's eyes, though, were not on him. They were fixed on the woman on the platform. "Papa," Daniel whispered, tugging harder now. "She looks sad." James shifted uncomfortably. "Keep your eyes down, son. This ain't no place for you." But Daniel didn't look away. His voice lowered, soft but insistent. "She needs us." James's jaw clenched. The words sank deeper than he wanted to admit. He turned his gaze back to the platform, really looking this time. The woman, no, the girl, stood rigid, her chin trembling, though she tried to hide it. The chain at her wrists gleamed, cruel against the delicate lines of her hands. And though she kept her eyes down, he caught a flicker of something raw in them. Despair, yes, but also a spark of defiance that had not yet been crushed. The auctioneer was shouting again. $9, do I hear 10? 10! 11! The laughter grew louder with each call, and James felt a slow burn rise in his chest. "Papa," Daniel whispered again. "Please." James's breath left him in a long exhale. He hadn't planned on this, hadn't thought beyond the day's chores on the long ride home. But life had a way of putting choices before him, and some couldn't be ignored. He stepped forward. The crowd noticed him immediately. Conversations hushed, replaced by snickers. James McAllister was known in Dry Creek, the quiet rancher with land on the outskirts, the widower raising a boy alone. They watched with hungry curiosity as he moved closer to the platform, his boots striking the dirt with steady weight. "I'll take her," James said, his voice even, carrying over the crowd. For a heartbeat, silence fell. Then, like a dam breaking, laughter exploded. "You'll what?" "McAllister, you lost your mind? Thought you swore off women after the last one died." The auctioneer blinked, caught off guard, then grinned wide. "Well now, here's a serious man. What's your bid, mister?" "McAllister?" James tightened his grip on Daniel's hand, squared his shoulders, and spoke clear. "My son needs her." The words cut through the jeering. For a moment, even the laughter faltered. Then the crowd roared again, louder than before, some hooting, some slapping their knees at the absurdity. "Your son needs her? Ha! Boy needs a nursemaid or a mother, not a chained-up foreigner." But James did not waver. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his coat and tossed it to the auctioneer. Coins clattered against the wood, the sound sharp in the sudden hush that followed. "There's my bid. It's enough." The auctioneer, sensing the drama, quickly scooped up the pouch and pretended to weigh it. Then, with the dramatic flourish of his gavel, he shouted, "Sold! To Mr. McAllister!" The gavel struck, sealing the moment. The crowd erupted again, some in disbelief, others in scorn. A few men spat in the dirt. One woman clutched her shawl tighter, muttering under her breath. But James didn't hear them anymore. He stepped to the platform, meeting the auctioneer's smug look with a stony glare. Without a word, he lifted Maylin's chain from the man's hand. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Hers were wide, unreadable, but beneath the fear he saw something else, something fragile that stirred inside him. He turned, leading her gently down the steps, Daniel trotting close at his side. The laughter followed them down the street, a chorus of mockery. "Crazy old fool! She'll run off before morning. Bet she don't last a week." But James kept walking, each step deliberate. The sun beat down, the dust swirled, and with every pace away from the auction block, the noise of the town seemed to fade. All that remained was the weight of the choice he had made, the warmth of his son's hand in his own, and the sound of the chains that clinked softly with each of Maylin's steps. For the first time since his wife's passing, James felt the stir of something unfamiliar, yet steady in his chest. Not certainty, not relief, but the beginning of a change he could not yet name. And behind him the laughter of Dry Creek carried on, not knowing that what had begun in cruelty would one day be remembered as the start of something stronger than any chain. The ride from Dry Creek to the McAllister Ranch stretched long beneath the afternoon sun. Dust lifted from the hooves of James's mare, drifting back to coat the wagon that followed. In it sat Maylin, silent and rigid, her shackled hands resting in her lap. Daniel perched beside her, legs swinging, eyes darting between his father's broad back and the woman who now shared their wagon seat. The road wound through open country, dry grasses swaying in the wind, and beyond them, the rolling hills stretched in muted gold and green. A hawk circled high above, its cry sharp against the endless sky. James kept his eyes forward, hands steady on the reins, though he felt the weight of the silence pressing down behind him. Maylin's gaze stayed low, but her mind was far away. Each jolt of the wagon carried her deeper into memories she tried not to hold. She remembered the crowded docks at San Francisco, where she had first stepped onto American soil, clutching a slip of paper with the name of the man she was promised to. He never appeared. Instead, rough hands and cruel bargains had turned her path toward Dry Creek, and now toward this ranch with the tall, silent man and his curious child. The wagon rattled over a rut, jerking her back to the present. Daniel, undisturbed, leaned toward her. "Do you talk?" he asked softly. Maylin glanced at him, startled, then quickly lowered her eyes again. The boy waited, hopeful, but when she didn't answer, he sighed and fiddled with the wooden horse he kept in his pocket. They reached the ranch by late afternoon. The land stretched wide, a humble house of weathered wood standing against the backdrop of hills, a barn with sagging beams and corrals where a handful of cattle grazed. It was not wealth, but it was steadiness, carved out of loneliness and sweat. James climbed down first, lifting Daniel to the ground. He turned to help Maylin, but she hesitated, clutching the edge of the wagon. At last, she allowed him to offer his hand. The chain between her wrists rattled softly as she stepped down, her feet meeting the dust of her new home. "This is it," James said quietly, more to himself than to her. Inside, the house bore the mark of a woman, long gone. A rocking chair stood in the corner by the fireplace, a patchwork quilt still draped over its back. Dishes were neatly stacked on shelves, but the air carried the faint mustiness of rooms rarely used. Daniel darted to his small room, his laughter briefly filling the house before fading again. James gestured toward the kitchen. "You'll stay here. I'll show you where to sleep." Maylin followed, moving carefully, eyes scanning everything as if committing it to memory. He led her to a narrow room off the hall, little more than a bed and a chest. She sat on the edge of the mattress, her chains clinking, her posture stiff. "I'll get those off you soon," James said awkwardly. "You won't need them here." Her head lifted slightly, eyes meeting his for the first time. There was disbelief there, and a question she didn't dare voice. He shifted, uncomfortable beneath her gaze. "You're safe now. No one's coming to take you." But safety was a word she had learned not to trust. That night the house was quiet, save for the creak of the wind through the shutters. James sat by the fire, whittling a piece of wood, his thoughts circling back to the choice he had made. The laughter of the town still rang in his ears. Foolish, they had called him. Desperate. Maybe they were right. But when Daniel had tugged at his hand, when he had looked into that woman's eyes, he'd felt something stronger than logic. Something that said a man had to stand when others mocked. In her room, Maylin sat awake, her hands free at last from the iron cuffs James had carefully unlocked. The skin beneath her wrists bore red marks, reminders of humiliation she wished to scrub away. She touched them gently, then lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The silence here was deep, broken only by the wind outside. She was far from the cries of the auction, far from the roar of the ocean she had crossed, but not yet close to anything like belonging. Days settled into a rhythm. At dawn, James rose to tend the cattle, his figure a steady shape against the pale light. Daniel followed when he could, his small boots pattering behind. Maylin remained near the house, sweeping, cooking simple meals, and watching the horizon with wary eyes. Her English was halting, her words scarce, but she listened, absorbing the rhythms of the ranch. Daniel was the first to break the walls she kept. One morning he placed his wooden horse on the table in front of her. "It's yours," he said, his grin shy. "You can keep it." Maylin blinked, taken aback. She shook her head, trying to give it back, but he pushed it toward her again. "No, you keep it." Her lips parted, the corners trembling with an emotion she quickly hid. She touched the toy gently, nodding once. In the evenings, after supper, James sometimes caught her humming softly, melodies unlike anything he'd heard. Daniel would sit nearby, listening with wide eyes. "It sounds pretty," he whispered once, though Maylin pretended not to hear. The town, however, did not forget. When James brought Maylin along for supplies, whispers followed them. Women clutched their children closer. Men smirked and muttered about the rancher's purchase. Maylin kept her head bowed, but each word struck like a stone. James's jaw tightened, his hand steady on the counter as he paid, but he said nothing. That night he found her sitting alone on the porch, staring at the stars. He stepped beside her, resting his hands on the railing. "They don't know you," he said, "and they don't know me. Best not to let their words matter." She turned her head, eyes catching his in the moonlight. "They laugh," she whispered, her accent thick. He nodded slowly. "They laughed at me, too." Silence stretched, but it was different now, less empty, more shared. The ranch was not easy. Fences broke, storms came, and work never ended. Yet in the midst of it, small changes grew. Daniel smiled more often. The house, once filled with silence, now carried the sound of Maylin's careful footsteps, her quiet voice teaching Daniel words in her language, her laughter, rare but soft when he mispronounced them. James noticed. He noticed the way she carried herself, fragile but unyielding. He noticed how she stitched torn shirts with delicate precision, how her hands lingered protectively near Daniel's shoulder, how her eyes softened when she thought no one watched. He also noticed the weight she carried. Some nights, when he passed her door, he heard her muffled sobs. He never intruded, but the sound stayed with him, carving something deep inside. The walls of the house held grief and memory, but slowly they also began to hold something new. Not trust, not yet, but the beginnings of it. And though the town's laughter still echoed in the distance, within the ranch's fences, a fragile silence began to turn into something almost like peace. The wind carried the smell of dust and horses into town that morning, the same way it always did, but there was a sharpness in the air that James felt before he even dismounted. Dry Creek was never kind, but it had a way of watching a man when he least wanted it. And since the day of the auction, every trip into town felt like riding into a pen of wolves waiting for weakness. Maylin walked at his side, her steps small, her shawl pulled tightly across her shoulders. Daniel skipped ahead a few feet, eager to reach the general store, where jars of penny candy waited behind glass. James's gaze moved constantly, faces turning, whispers stirring, laughter breaking out and cutting off as he passed. It began outside the blacksmith's, where two men leaned against a post. "There goes McAllister," one drawled. "Looks like he brought his prize." The other spat into the dirt. "Man's got no shame. Buying himself a China girl like she's a sack of grain." James kept walking. His jaw tightened, but his pace didn't slow. Daniel's laughter rang out as he tugged at the store door, unaware of the venom curling in the voices around him. Inside, the store was crowded. Women with baskets on their arms, men with lists in hand, all turned when Maylin entered. The silence lasted only a moment before it broke into low murmurs. "She don't belong here. Can't speak a word of proper English, I bet. Reckon she cooks strange food, too." Poor McAllister. Maylin lowered her eyes, clutching the edge of her shawl. James stepped forward, gathering the items he needed with slow precision. Flour, nails, lamp oil. His hands moved with practiced steadiness, but inside he felt the heat rise. Daniel pressed his nose against the glass jar of candy, his breath fogging it. "Papa, can I have just one?" he asked, his voice bright. James reached into his pocket, pulling out a few coins. "Pick one, son." Daniel turned, grinning at Maylin. "You choose two," he said, holding out the jar toward her. Her eyes widened, startled. She shook her head quickly. "No, no." "Yes," Daniel insisted, his hand gentle against her sleeve. "Please." She hesitated then, with trembling fingers, pointed at a small piece of peppermint wrapped in red-striped paper. Daniel placed it on the counter proudly. "For her," he said. The store clerk, a thin man with a sour face, raised a brow but said nothing as he took the coins. Around them the whispers swelled louder. "Buying candy for her now? Next thing you know, she'll be running that house." James's hand closed around the sack of supplies. His voice, low and steady, cut through the noise. "That'll be all." He guided Maylin and Daniel out, his steps heavy, his back straight. Outside, the sun seemed harsher than before. Maylin's hands shook slightly as she unwrapped the peppermint. Daniel beamed up at her, waiting. Slowly, she placed it on her tongue. The sweetness surprised her, and for the first time since she had stepped foot in Dry Creek, Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. Daniel laughed, clapping his hands. "See, you like it." The sound of his joy softened something in James, but the moment didn't last. A group of men stood waiting near the hitching post. They were the same who had shouted loudest at the auction, their faces flushed with drink even in the morning. "Well, well," one sneered. "Look what we got here. McAllister and his little foreign treasure." James placed the sack in the wagon, his body tense. "We're leaving." But the men stepped closer, circling. One spat in the dirt near Mei Lin's feet. "Don't reckon you deserve her, McAllister. Some of us had bids too. Maybe we want another chance." Daniel pressed closer to his father, eyes wide. Mei Lin froze, her breath shallow, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. James turned slowly, his eyes hard as stone. "You had your chance. She's mine now." Laughter erupted, coarse and ugly. "Yours? She ain't nothing but chattel. You think buying her makes you a man?" The largest of the group stepped forward, shoving James in the chest. James staggered back a step, but didn't fall. His hand shot out, gripping the man's collar, and before the others could react, his fist drove forward, cracking against the man's jaw. The thug stumbled, cursing, blood at his lip. The others surged. Fists flew, boots kicked, shouts echoed through the street. James fought with the fury of a man who had lost too much already, every strike driven not by pride, but by the need to protect. A blow caught his ribs, another split his brow, but he did not fall. Through the chaos, Mei Lin clutched Daniel, pulling him back against the wagon, shielding him with her body. Her eyes were wide with terror, yet beneath it burned something fierce, a refusal to let harm come to the boy. At last, the sheriff's voice thundered from the end of the street. "Enough!" The men scattered, spitting curses as they backed away. James stood, chest heaving, blood trickling down his temple. His fists were raw, his shirt torn. The sheriff gave him a long look. "You'd best keep trouble off my street, McAllister. Next time I won't be so forgiving." James wiped the blood from his brow. "I didn't start it. Maybe not, but you sure finished it." The sheriff tipped his hat, turning away. Silence lingered in the wake of the fight. James turned to Mei Lin and Daniel. Daniel's small hands clung to her dress, his face buried against her side. Mei Lin met James's gaze, her eyes shining, not with fear, but with something else. Gratitude, something deeper. That night, back at the ranch, James sat at the table, wincing as he cleaned the cut above his eye. His ribs ached with every breath. The room was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire. Then Mei Lin appeared, carrying a basin of water and a cloth. Without a word, she knelt beside him. Gently, she pressed the cloth to his wound. Her hands were light, careful, trembling only slightly. "You shouldn't," James began, but she silenced him with a look. Her eyes, dark and steady, held his. For the first time, he saw past the walls of silence she carried. He saw the pain she hid, the scars of humiliation, but also the strength that remained. Her touch lingered longer than needed, her breath catching once as she dabbed at the blood. When she finally pulled back, she whispered softly, "Thank you." It was the first time she had spoken to him directly, the words fragile yet clear. James swallowed hard, his voice rough. "You don't need to thank me. You're safe here. I'll make sure of it." From the corner of the room, Daniel stirred in his chair, half asleep, murmuring, "Mama." The word hung in the air, heavy and tender. Mei Lin's eyes widened, her lips parting, but she said nothing. Daniel's head lolled, and he drifted into sleep again. James watched her, the silence stretching. He wanted to speak, to tell her she was not alone anymore, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he reached out, covering her hand with his. Just for a moment. And in that moment, the distance between them began to shift. The first snow came silently in the night. By morning, the McAllister ranch lay buried under a white sheet that stretched to the horizon. The fences capped in frost, the cattle huddled close in the corrals, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The house creaked with the weight of it, every board moaning under the cold. James stood at the window, his arms crossed against his chest, watching the gray light creep across the hills. Winter had always been hard, but this one felt heavier. Supplies were thin, and every day's work stretched his body closer to breaking. He glanced toward the small figure still curled under a quilt in the corner bed. His boy Daniel, cheeks flushed with warmth. Then his eyes moved to the kitchen, where Mei-Lin bent over the stove, coaxing a fire to life with careful hands. She had been with them long enough now that her presence had become woven into the fabric of the house. The mornings no longer felt hollow with silence. There was the sound of her stirring a pot, the faint hum of her voice as she worked, sometimes the gentle click of her sewing needle. James told himself it was necessity. Someone had to tend the boy, someone had to keep the house while he worked the land. Yet he found himself watching her, more often than he cared to admit. When the fire finally caught, Mei-Lin straightened, her face flushed from the heat, stray strands of dark hair falling across her cheek. She brushed them back quickly when she noticed his eyes on her. "Cold day," James said, his voice rough. She nodded, her English still slow but steady enough. "Cold, yes." The wind rattled the shutters, making the house shiver around them. James pulled on his coat, reaching for his gloves. "I'll check the cattle." Her gaze flicked toward the door, then back to him. "Too cold. Dangerous." He gave a faint smile, weary but grateful. "It always is. But they won't last without feed." She hesitated as though she might say more, then simply lowered her eyes and returned to the stove. By the time he came back inside, his breath freezing in his beard, Daniel was awake, and Mei-Lin was setting a bowl of porridge on the table. The boy rubbed sleep from his eyes, his small body swaddled in wool, and smiled when she placed the bowl in front of him. "Zi-ri," he lisped clumsily, the Chinese words she had taught him sounding strange and sweet in his mouth. Mei-Lin's eyes widened, then softened. She touched his hair lightly, murmuring something in her own tongue. James watched the exchange quietly, his chest tightening. The days passed with the snow deepening, the world shrinking to the size of their small ranch house. They fell into rhythm. James mended tools by the fire when the storms howled. Daniel played at Mei-Lin's side, chattering endlessly, drawing pictures in the frost on the windows. Mei-Lin cooked what little they had left, stretching meals with herbs and bits of dried meat, her resourcefulness keeping hunger from the door. But as January turned cruel, shadows fell across their fragile peace. Daniel began coughing one night, a deep, rattling sound that woke James from sleep. At first it seemed a simple cold, but within days his small body burned with fever. His laughter vanished, replaced by weak whimpers as he curled under his blanket. James tried everything he knew, wrapping the boy in quilts, boiling water for steam, sending prayers into the howling dark outside. But the fever held fast, and fear crept into every corner of the house. Mei-Lin sat beside Daniel's bed, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth. Her own memories stirred, memories of sickness that swept through villages back home, of mothers losing children because medicine was far and doctors farther still. She closed her eyes, whispering prayers in her own tongue, then looked up at James. "We need doctor," she said. "There's no reaching him," James answered, his voice breaking with frustration. "Roads buried under snow. By the time I make it back, it'll be too late." The truth hung heavy between them. Daniel coughed again, his small body shaking. Mei-Lin's hands clenched, then released. Slowly she rose and went to the cupboard, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. From within, she drew dried roots and leaves, carefully tied with string. James frowned. "What's that?" "Medicine," she said simply. "From China?" His tone carried both doubt and desperate hope. She nodded. "My mother, she teach me, for fever, for lungs." James hesitated. He had seen her gather herbs before, muttering words he did not understand, steeping teas that smelled sharp and foreign. He had never questioned it, but now his son's life lay between belief and doubt. "What if it makes him worse?" he asked. Her dark eyes lifted to his, steady and unflinching. "Trust me." It was the first time she had spoken those words to him. They struck deeper than he expected. He looked back at his son, pale and trembling, and then at the woman before him. Slowly he nodded. "Do it." Mei Lin worked through the night. She boiled water, crushed roots with a stone, stirred bitter tea until the air filled with its sharp scent. She coaxed Daniel to sip, whispering soft words in her language, stroking his hair until his cries faded into restless sleep. James sat beside her, helpless but watchful, every nerve stretched taut. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, snow piling against the door, but inside the house, a fragile battle was being fought with steam and prayer and stubborn faith. By dawn, the fever had not broken, but Daniel's breathing eased. His skin, once burning, cooled slightly beneath Mei Lin's touch. She sagged with relief, her hands trembling as she wrung out another cloth. James caught her wrist gently, his rough fingers closing around her smaller ones. "You saved him," he whispered. She shook her head, exhaustion in her eyes. "Not yet. We wait." For 3 days they waited. Mei Lin scarcely slept, her body bent over Daniel's bed, feeding him sips of her remedies, singing lullabies that James did not understand but felt deep in his chest. James tended the fire, kept the cattle alive, and when the fear threatened to crush him, he sat quietly beside her, letting her strength steady him. On the 4th morning, as pale sunlight slipped through the frost-covered window, Daniel opened his eyes. His small voice croaked, weak but clear. "Papa?" James's heart nearly broke with the rush of relief. He leaned close, brushing his son's hair back. "I'm here, boy. I'm here." Daniel's gaze shifted to Mei Lin, who knelt beside him, tears streaming unchecked down her face. With a faint smile, he whispered, "Mama!" The word hung in the air like a bell. James's throat tightened, his vision blurred. Mei Lin pressed a trembling hand to her lips, unable to speak, but the look in her eyes said everything. When Daniel fell back into gentle sleep, James turned to her. His voice was rough, raw with emotion. "He called you what I've been too afraid to say. You're part of us now." Mei Lin shook her head, tears still falling. "I don't belong." "Yes, you do." His hand covered hers, warm and firm. "You saved him. You saved me. This house was empty until you came." She closed her eyes, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. And when she finally leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, James held her. Feeling the truth settle deep within him, the storm passed. The snow began to melt, revealing the earth beneath. But something greater had changed inside that small ranch house. In the crucible of winter, in the shadow of death, bonds had been forged that neither laughter nor prejudice could break. The snows melted slowly that year, the hills turning from white to gray to green, as if the earth itself was waking from a long sleep. Streams of meltwater ran down into the valleys, filling the creeks, carrying the memory of winter away. For weeks, the McAllister Ranch smelled of damp soil and new grass, the sharp scent of pine carried down from the mountains. It was the season of beginning again, though James McAllister knew that beginnings were not so simple. Life had changed in ways he could not have imagined when he had stepped forward at that cursed auction. He had thought himself a fool then, mocked and laughed at, yet each day that passed showed him the truth, that the moment he had taken Mei Lin's chain in his hand, everything he thought he had lost was slowly being restored. Daniel was living proof of it. The boy, once pale and silent with grief, now ran through the fields with laughter on his lips, his wooden horse forgotten in the grass as he chased butterflies and shouted proudly in words Mei Lin had taught him. His small voice sang broken pieces of Chinese songs, mixing them with English rhymes in a way that made her laugh quietly behind her hand. James watched them often, his son and the woman who had come into their lives as a stranger and who now filled the house with warmth. He would stand at the porch, his arms folded, his hat low over his eyes, pretending to study the horizon while secretly letting the sight settle deep into him. It was not easy, not yet. The town had not forgotten. When he rode into Dry Creek, whispers still followed him. Women turned their faces away. Men smirked or spat in the dirt. their laughter lingering long after he passed. Yet something in James had shifted. Once, he might have lowered his eyes, let the shame weigh on him. Now he rode tall, his back straight, as though their scorn had lost its teeth. Because when he returned home, he found something more powerful waiting for him than all their laughter combined. One Sunday, he decided they would all go into town for church. The decision was not made lightly. He knew the looks they would receive, but it was time, he thought. Time to stop hiding. Time to show the world that his house was not broken, but whole. The morning dawned clear. Mei Lin dressed with care, smoothing her simple dress until not a wrinkle remained, braiding her hair with trembling hands. Daniel burst into her room holding a wildflower he had plucked from the yard. "For you, Mama," he said proudly. The words still caught in her chest each time, but she accepted the flower with a soft smile, tucking it into her braid. James saw them from the doorway, his heart tightening with something he could no longer deny. They rode into town together, Daniel perched between them on the saddle, his small arms clinging to Mei Lin's waist. The streets grew quiet as they passed, eyes turning, whispers beginning. But James held his head high, and Mei Lin, though her cheeks burned, kept her gaze fixed ahead. Inside the church, silence spread like wildfire. Every pew seemed to bristle with disapproval. The pastor cleared his throat, faltering for a moment before beginning the hymn. James led his family to a bench near the back, ignoring the way women gathered their skirts as if Mei Lin carried sickness. Then Daniel's clear voice rose above the hymn. Off-key but strong, he sang the words with all his small heart. When the verse ended, he tugged at Mei Lin's hand. "Sing too," he whispered. Her lips parted, uncertain. She had never sung in this place, never in front of so many staring eyes. But Daniel's trust was like a flame. She opened her mouth, and her voice, soft, trembling, yet true, joined the hymn. The sound carried through the church, foreign, yet beautiful, and for a moment, even the whispers fell silent. James closed his eyes, listening, pride swelling in his chest. He had not heard music in his home since his wife died. Yet now it filled not only the church, but every corner of his heart. After the service, as they walked back into the sunlight, a group of men muttered nearby. "McAllister's gone soft, letting that woman sit in the Lord's house." James turned, his eyes hard. "She has more grace than any of you. Best hold your tongues." The men sneered but said nothing more. Mei Lin's hand tightened on Daniel's shoulder, her other hand brushing lightly against James's arm as if to steady him. He looked down, and the touch lingered longer than necessary. Spring brought long days of work. Fences to mend, calves to brand, seeds to plant in the small garden behind the house. Mei Lin threw herself into the labor, her hands blistered yet tireless. She learned quickly how to knead bread with flour ground from coarse grain, how to mend harnesses, how to milk the cows in the cool mornings. At night, she collapsed into bed exhausted, but her heart beat with a strange new rhythm. This was not servitude, not chains. This was life, fragile and fierce, and for the first time since leaving her homeland, she felt as though she belonged to it. The bond between her and Daniel grew unbreakable. He followed her everywhere, chattering questions, begging for stories of her village, laughing at the strange words she taught him. Sometimes he would crawl into her lap by the fire, his head against her chest, and she would stroke his hair until he slept. James would watch from his chair, the sight carving itself into his soul. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, James found himself lingering in the doorway of the kitchen. Mei Lin stood at the table, her sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her hands as she shaped a loaf of bread. The lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, the strands of hair that had fallen loose from her braid. She hummed softly, unaware he was watching. Something stirred in him then, something he had held back for months. It was not the sharp, hungry desire of a man for a woman. It was deeper, steadier, a love that had grown quietly, like roots beneath the soil, until he could no longer pretend it wasn't there. He stepped forward, his voice low. "Mei Lin." She looked up, startled, her hands stilled, the flower clinging to her fingers. Yes? He hesitated, words catching in his throat. He had faced storms, cattle stampedes, men with fists and knives, yet this moment frightened him more than all of it. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her eyes searched his, wary, waiting. "I bought you that day because my son begged me to," he said slowly. "Because he needed someone. I thought that was all it was. But now—" He stepped closer, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Now I know it's me who needs you." Her breath caught. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick between them. "You don't have to stay out of duty," he whispered. "I want you here because His voice broke, and he swallowed hard. "Because I love you." Silence stretched. Malin's hands trembled. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. "I am afraid," she whispered. "Always I am outsider. Always people laugh." He cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away the tears. "Let them laugh. They don't know what I know. That you're the strongest woman I've ever met. That you saved my boy's life. That you saved mine." Her lips parted, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then, slowly, she raised her hand to cover his. Her voice was soft, but steady. "I love you too." The words broke the last barrier between them. James leaned down, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, a promise forged in fire and winter and all the pain they had endured. Maylin clung to him, her tears mingling with his breath, her heart pounding against his. When they pulled apart, Daniel's sleepy voice called from the other room. "Mama? Papa?" They laughed softly, their foreheads resting together. James whispered, "We'll tell him tomorrow that this family is whole." Outside, the crickets sang, and the stars spread across the night sky like a blessing. Days later, James led Maylin into the pasture at sunset. Daniel ran ahead, chasing the long shadows, his laughter carrying on the wind. James took Maylin's hand, rough and calloused against her delicate fingers, and stopped beneath the wide sky. "Marry me," he said simply, "not as property, not as obligation. As my partner, as the woman I love." Tears filled her eyes once more, but this time they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. He pulled her into his arms, and the setting sun painted them in gold. Daniel, seeing them, clapped his hands and shouted, "We're a family!" And they were. Against laughter, against cruelty, against every shadow of prejudice, they had built something stronger than chains. They had built love. The story that began with jeers and mockery ended with a rancher, a woman once sold in chains, and a boy who had found his mother again. And as they walked back to the house together, the sound of their footsteps blended into one, carrying them into a future no laughter could ever undo. From chains and ridicule to trust, family, and a love stronger than prejudice, Maylin and James found their way through heartache into hope. What began as a cruel spectacle ended as a timeless reminder that love can rise where the world least expects it. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles so you never miss another heartwarming story of courage, redemption, and romance on the untamed frontier.